President Donald Trump's latest executive order on trade calls for review of all U.S. free trade agreements, including NAFTA and the World Trade Organization Pact, and possible renegotiation of any deal to eliminate violations and abuses, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said Friday. Trump plans to sign the order on Saturday, his 100th day in office, a milestone he will mark with a rally in Harrisburg, PA. He had wanted to use the occasion to sign a different order, triggering a complete withdrawal from NAFTA, but turned away from that idea earlier this week amid backlash in Congress and the business community, the council of various members of his administration, and phone calls with the leaders of Mexico and Canada. The report he's ordering up will examine free trade deals the United States has with 20 countries, as well as the WTO agreement. Recommendations will follow in 180 days. Ross cautioned against any expectation that the report would recommend the U.S. withdraw from the WTO or any of the bilateral pacts, but he did not completely rule out possibility if countries are unwilling to address problems contributing to the U.S. trade deficit. Withdrawal is the most extreme form of renegotiation, Ross said in a briefing. And so, to me, it would be really more of the last resort. Now, it's also possible some of the parties here will refuse to negotiate. And if they do, then that doesn't leave you an awful lot of alternatives. The Trump administration, like no other in recent U.S. history, sees America's trade deficit as a major problem that needs solving, and fast. It looks with suspicion on trade agreements negotiated by previous administrations. In his first week in office, Trump pulled out of the One-Two-Nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, his predecessor's effort to cement U.S. influence over Asia-Pacific trade. Trump, who campaigned on bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., signed an executive order in late March directing the Commerce Department and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to examine the causes of significant bilateral trade deficits, and in the past 2 weeks, he has directed Ross to expeditiously carry out investigations. Could lead to restrictions on steel and aluminum imports on national security grounds. Trump's new trade review, according to a fact sheet put out by the White House, would evaluate trade agreements to determine whether they are working for America, and whether the predicted results, in terms of jobs and economic growth, are being achieved. It said Trump has been very clear. Our trade agreements must increase U.S. economic growth, contribute favorably to the balance of trade, and strengthen the manufacturing base. This performance review will assess each agreement to determine if it is meeting standard, the fact sheet added. Most economists believe the trade deficit's root cause has less to do with trade policy than the fact the U.S. spends more than it saves and therefore draws in goods from abroad. But Ross indicated he believed the trade deficit is a result of inequities in trade agreements, particularly at the WTO, which he attacked in point after point. That's really the grandparent of all trade arrangements that we have, Ross said. And as far as I can tell, there has never been a systematic evaluation of what has been the impact of the WTO agreement on the country as an integrated whole. The largest portion of the overall U.S. trade deficit is with the countries that are really just covered by WTO rules, as opposed to countries that are covered by individual free trade agreements, Ross said, noting the U.S. has a free trade agreement with just one country, South Korea. That makes the top 10 list of its bilateral trade deficits. The US's largest trade deficit in goods is with China, which totaled $347 billion in 2016, or about 43% of the total goods deficit of $750 billion. The US and China do not have a bilateral free trade agreement. Ross complained about a central tenet of the WTO, known as Most Favored Nation status, which prevents members from setting different tariffs for different countries, unless the two members have negotiated a separate free trade agreement. If we have a country that has big trade barriers against us, we should logically have similar trade barriers against them, Ross said. The only problem is the World Trade Organization has what's called a Most Favored Nation clause, meaning of all the countries with which we do not have a free trade agreement, we must charge the same tariff on the same item to each of those countries. The U.S. has generally low tariffs as a result of decisions it made after World War II to jumpstart the global economy. But economists argue that has helped make the U.S. the most powerful country on the planet, with the 11th highest level of per capita income, at around $57,000. We benefited a lot from the contract we wrote with other countries at the start of the post-war period, was a substantial benefit for the U.S. economy, as well as the world economy, said Jeffrey Schott, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It basically pulled the West out of a great big hole after World War II, and created great prosperity. We wouldn't have much trade if we didn't have prosperous trading partners. As one-sided as the current system may seem, it's unrealistic to think the U.S. can persuade other countries to lower their tariffs to the same level without offering something new in exchange, Schott said. In any renegotiation, developing countries would most likely demand cuts in sensitive U.S. sectors like agriculture, which is in the midst of a downturn. The president has been complaining about Canadian dairy barriers, but other countries complain about U.S. dairy policy and our sugar policy, Schott added. While we have a generally open market, we do have a few sensitive areas, and those are things other countries would want to see addressed. But Ross' gripes about the WTO are many. He complained about how long it takes to resolve disputes, and that its panels appear to be biased against the U.S. The Geneva-based trade body also doesn't adequately deal with a number of other issues, he said, such as non-tariff barriers to exports, intellectual property theft, and protections for digital trade. Not done making his case, Ross took aim at WTO reports documenting the number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, which have been rising in recent years. Ross said the WTO takes the side of countries dumping and subsidizing their exports, rather than countries that are imposing duties to keep out unfairly traded imports. There's an institutional bias toward the exporters rather than toward people who have been beleaguered by inappropriate imports, Ross said. But the secretary predicted it was more likely the final report would suggest the U.S. seek changes to the WTO, which dates to 1995, rather than walk away from the agreement. Any entity that's been going for a real long time needs to be updated, he said, making an argument the administration has also used against NAFTA. I don't think there's any question about that. I think there's also no question that we need some kind of arbiter of international trade, So at the 40,000 foot level, there's a need.